brethren, without further ado, I'd like to introduce for your education, edification, and entertainment, Brother C.R. Chuck Dunning. Brother Chuck has been a part of my Masonic career from basically the very beginning. I had the opportunity to go to an event shortly after I became a Master Mason, where Chuck was the host, and was extremely impressed. The philosophy that Chuck imparted to me about Masonry as a contemplative practice and also kind of a mental health recovery system. The talks that I got to see him do over the years have been phenomenal. And I brought him out here several years ago for Esoteric Lodge to inspire the Lodge to understand how Masonry can be used for meditation and spiritual healing and growth. And so when I had an opportunity this year to try to track down somebody for this event, I really wanted to look no further than Brother Chuck. So I hope that he thoroughly entertains you, try to grab onto every morsel of wisdom that he has to impart. And with that, Brother Chuck.
Thank you, wardens, distinguished guests, brethren all, for the privilege of being able to speak with you today. I'm honored. I'll do my best to make it worth your while. This presentation runs about 40 minutes, and then after that, I hope we have some time for discussion. So if some questions occur to you along the way, feel free to jot them down, type them into your phone, or just put them back here in your memory palace somewhere, and then we can have something to talk about when I'm through going on and on. I do want to preface what I say by, I always try to do this because things differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Everything that I put in this presentation is from a monitor. So it's published, as far as I know. Again, that differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. If I reveal something that your jurisdiction considers to be one of the official secrets of Freemasonry, then I hope you won't take the penalty part of your obligation too literally. Just a kind reminder would be enough, or some advice. Also, this presentation, one of the reasons that I chose this particular presentation for this group is because of my dear friend Eric Arneson. Eric is also, I don't know if any of you have noticed this, Eric is also the editor for my newest book, The Contemplative Lodge. So if there's anything in there that you don't quite understand, or there's a typo or something like that, just talk to Eric about it. All right. This presentation, a lot of times I like to just give an extemporaneous talk. Sometimes that is a little more genuine, it's easier to follow, but I've got a lot of points that I want to make today, and I want to weave them together very carefully, and so I'm going to be reading quite a bit today. I'm going to move through some pretty significant concepts, some of which I think are going to be very familiar to some of you, some of which may not be. And again, I trust that if you want some clarification on something, that'll come up in conversation later. So if you've read my book, Contemplative Masonry, then you know that the word esoteric, for me, most importantly refers to that which is within us, the internal and not the external realm of our existence. Esoteric engagement, then, is inner work or our contemplative and meditative efforts to access the hidden recesses of our hearts and minds, to develop and integrate the various parts of our souls. One of the most powerful ways that we can do such inner work is recalling, meditating upon, and creatively experimenting with imagery. This is a psychological and spiritual technology that has been used in every great religious tradition and is certainly part of many indigenous spiritual traditions. I was having a conversation with Brother Dorje. It's very much a part of Vajrayana Buddhism, for example. It's in every great tradition. Masonry seems tailor-made to benefit from this technology, and this presentation is designed to give you a deeper look into how it works and how we might benefit from it. Masonry's chock full of imagery. But we can hardly do justice to this topic without picking something specific to serve as an example for our discussion. We could use the working tools, our ancient 3 Grand Masters, even the traditional degree carpets or trestle boards. But for various reasons, we will be focusing on the 4 cardinal and 3 theological virtues. Engaging the virtues through their images has been done for a long time in Western religion, philosophy, and esotericism. I also understand that many of you may already be familiar with practices like these, and so again, I encourage your contribution to our conversation afterwards. On this slide, you see portrayals of the virtues like those commonly found in Masonic literature and lecture slides. Masonic buildings, like this wonderful edifice, also sometimes contain statues or paintings or stained glass depictions of them. Sadly, in some jurisdictions, Masons no longer see such images, either in the conferral of their degrees, anywhere within their lodge buildings, and sometimes not even in the monitors or other official publications of their jurisdictions. But these images are an important part of our tradition. We have inherited the use of such images quite literally from time immemorial, and for some very good reasons. It's working. I believe these images should still be employed as part of ordinary Masonic education for every Mason. So in this presentation, I will try to explain how they came to us, why they are important, and how we can make better use of them. We should understand that Masonry did not invent these personified images of the virtues. When the virtues were included in Masonic ritual, such images were widely known both in and out of the fraternity. Furthermore, they had already been commonly found in art and used in religion and education for many centuries. This painting of the theological and cardinal virtues by Francesco Pessalino is from about 1450. The style is called an allegory, which in itself is worthy of note to those who practice a peculiar morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. In the Middle Ages, it became common to refer to artistic personifications of virtues and divine attributes as allegories, meaning these qualities were being symbolically represented. That meaning for the term allegory continued into the Renaissance, but the practice of using visual images to personify specific principles or qualities is much more ancient. In fact, the polytheistic religions have their gods portrayed this way and have done so for many thousands of years. For example, many coins of ancient Rome are stamped with an image of Providentia, who is actually the source for both our words providence and prudence. Providence being a divine attribute and prudence a human virtue. As you can see, there are some noteworthy parallels between images of Providentia and those of prudence. Personification of divine attributes and virtues is obviously not practiced only among polytheists. In the book of Proverbs, divine wisdom is not only, where are we? Yes, there we go. Personification of the divine attributes and virtues is obviously not practiced only among polytheists. In the book of Proverbs, divine wisdom is not only referred to as feminine in character, but she is actually quoted as speaking for herself, explaining who she is, her role in creation, and what she has to offer those who answer her call. This picture is an allegory by an unknown artist of the 16th century and presents wisdom as described in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1. Quote, "Wisdom hath builded her house, she hath hewn out her 7 pillars," end quote. Notice in the painting that wisdom's throne is supported by 7 pillars. At this point, I'm kind of tempted to go off on a tangent about the 7 liberal arts and sciences being a good basis for wisdom, but I'll just leave that for your further contemplation if you choose to do so. For now, the point is that artistic personification of human virtues and divine attributes has been a natural and meaningful practice among people of many faiths from prehistoric times all the way through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, and into the modern era. Part of the reason for personifying things in human-like form is that we were using visual images to record and communicate important events, hopes, fears, dreams, and ideas long before we developed alphabets and written languages. It just seems to be part of our nature. In fact, letters are themselves highly abstracted pictures that we developed to represent particular sounds. Said another way, we repeatedly limited a picture to simpler and more abstract forms, moving it further and further from the visual representation of anything other than a specific sound. The development of words composed of letters helped us visually represent things, to write them down in ways precise enough to eliminate much of the need for explanation about what was being communicated. So why bother with images as teaching instruments? If written and spoken words are more precise, why use images at all? Part of the answer is that while the written word can be more precise, it can also be less evocative and inspiring. That's how we came to a point where we could say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Pictures can communicate many possibilities, layers, and nuances of meaning. Some of them even seem to be in opposition with each other. That range of possibilities allows for a person to develop interpretations and applications in ways that may be more relevant and meaningful to that individual than anybody else's explanations ever could be. It also allows for epiphanies, the aha moments of insight that can facilitate significant changes in the way a person thinks about something or applies it to life. Another reason for the personification of virtues in visual images is what is nowadays known in the scientific community as the picture superiority effect, which observes that we tend to recall images better than words. This is a highly studied phenomenon. Back in 2020, the spring of 2020, I did a Google search and found that there were over 500,000 total Google hits for scholarly articles on the picture superiority effect. And over 17,000, nearly 18,000 of them had been written just since 2019, the start of 2019. The picture superiority effect is of great interest to neurologists, educational theorists, and of course, to the fields of marketing, advertising, and public relations. The prevailing theories for this effect say it happens because pictures typically generate both images and words in our minds, whereas words do both less frequently. The presence of both words and images encoded in our memory provides more mental points of contact by which the image can be recalled. Also, because of all their details, pictures have more potential to be distinct from one another than words are from each other. These additional details facilitate more connections with other images, words, memories, and various thoughts and feelings. Thus, images can be attached with more meaning, and all those connections provide even more mental points of contact by which an image and the things associated with it can be remembered. While the picture superiority effect has become a matter of modern scientific research, human beings have been working with it for thousands of years and finding other benefits to working with personified images of spiritual things. In the ancient polytheistic religions, the gods are not only thought of as spiritual beings with their own lives, but are also regarded as present in or influential on human beings through particular characteristics, traits, or behaviors. Divine attributes and human virtues have thus been intimately linked for a very long time. So, personifying a virtue emphasizes its relevance to our lives in this world, while also suggesting that it has a reality beyond any single human being. That in effect, a virtue has a life of its own, and we can develop a relationship with it. So, our ability to recall images better than words, combined with the broader possibilities of meaning in images, and the relatability of human or semi-human forms, better helps us understand why we have so often portrayed divine attributes and human virtues in personified images. This is why such images have always been central to the language of the mysteries, and thus they have been and should continue to be a vital part of every Mason's experience. There is also evidence that pairing an image with certain words can make it easier to recall those words. As we all know, remembering the words of our rituals and in many jurisdictions of our catechisms is an important part of the Masonic experience. In our own lifetimes, many of us have seen it become de-emphasized. But if we look back to the very roots of our craft, we can see that memorization was vitally important to our operative forebears, and for very good reasons that are still relevant today. From 1583 to 1602, William Shaw was the Master of Works to the Crown of Scotland, King James VI. In 1598, he was also General Warden of Master Stonemasons, and he issued statutes to govern the craft, shown on the left. In the revision of 1599, he specifically used the phrase art of memory, as shown on the right. Masonic historians like David Stevenson have made persuasive cases that Shaw was in contact with Alexander Desconi, a personal student and friend of Giordano Bruno, who was known all across Europe for his work in the art of memory. Shaw was also in contact with William Fowler, the royal court's teacher in the art of memory, and an acquaintance of Bruno. So, Shaw undoubtedly had a sophisticated understanding of the art of memory. Keep in mind that Freemasonry, as we know it, didn't yet exist. Even so, we can see how an appreciation for the art of memory could have been passed to early speculatives by our operative forebears. A careful study of the art of memory, as it was understood and practiced in the 16th century, reveals that it was not merely about rote memorization and the recitation of words. Its practitioners were also interested in how storing and accessing things in memory could expand our comprehension of them and our ability to communicate them to others. Memory was also considered to be strongly connected with imagination, creativity, and spirituality, all of which is certainly relevant to Masonry and its aims of making us better builders of wiser, stronger, and more beautiful souls in society. So, the questions now are about how we can employ the power of personifying virtues, the picture superiority effect, and the art of memory. What can we actually do with them, and how might we benefit? We have already discovered that images are more easily remembered than words. It follows that images of the personified virtue should help us remember them at times when it might be helpful to do so. Times when recalling and applying the qualities of a particular virtue might be just what we need. Like last night when we were out having a beer and I remembered temperance. There's also evidence that pairing an image with certain words can make it easier to recall those words. And so using images of the virtues can help us remember the explanations we traditionally associate with them. So one application of our knowledge is simply to gaze on the images of the virtues while rehearsing what our ritual says about them, and then recall those images when we wish to recite the words to others. As important as it is to do our best in reciting things from ritual, it is even more important to have deeply meaningful understandings of them to apply in our lives. After all, the members of the lodge, not the words of the ritual, are the living stones we're really trying to perfect in our craft. With that in mind, let's turn our attention to how the visual personification of the virtues can help us gain greater appreciation of their meanings. Here are the cardinal virtues from the previously shown allegory by Pasolini. Beginning on the left, they are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Note the objects that distinguish one from another and represent the particular qualities of each. These objects are part of a symbolic language used since ancient times to let the viewer know that a personified image not only represents a particular mythic character, divine attribute, or human virtue, but also elaborates on those qualities associated with that virtue. In this case, the objects serve as clues to various aspects of each virtue. As we proceed through the next several slides, take note of the similarities and differences of these objects and see what they suggest to you about each virtue. We can see similar clues in these engravings by Montaigne. From left to right, they are temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. Here again is one of the most common images of the cardinal virtues in Freemasonry with temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice. These are the theological virtues by Pasolini. Charity is obviously in the middle. To one side is fides, which is Latin for faith, and on the other side is spes, or hope. Continue looking for and contemplating the visual clues associated with each of them in the following pictures. Here's a beautiful set of stained glass windows with faith on the left, then charity, and finally hope on the right. And again, we have the three theological virtues on this popular version of the EA trestle board. Here we see charity at the top of the EA's ladder, hope in the middle, and faith at the foot. One more time, consider the objects included with each personification of the virtues. Now, are you ready for a pop quiz? I want you to think about these clues that we see associated with the virtues. Ready or not, here we go. And I don't expect anybody to actually respond out loud, but if you feel moved to do so, please do. So what do you recall being the clues with charity? Babies. And fire. Okay, two of the more popular ones. There we see some of the others. And what about hope? What do you remember being associated with hope, Sean? The anchor and the key. Okay, well, there we go. And what about faith? Cross, open book. Good, good. Just so take a moment to review those clues for the three theological virtues. Now let's see about the four cardinal virtues, starting with prudence. What objects did you see in her pictures? Mirror. Yes, often a serpent, sometimes biting her. Okay? And how about justice? Right, of all the virtues, the scales and sword of justice are probably the most widely known clues of any virtue in modern times. Okay, let's think back on the images of temperance. What objects did she have? Yeah, so vessels of water, right. And finally, fortitude. Yes, typically broken, by the way. It's interesting, isn't it? What's that? Armor. Yeah, a helmet is often part of it. A sword is often there. So I thought you did pretty good. So just take a moment to look over all seven. And then we'll move on. One thing is for certain, the more you look at these images, the more details you will find and recall. But as we've already discussed, the details are only important to the extent that we contemplate them for more meaning. So while we might use the images to simply help us recall what ritual tells us about the virtues, there is a second, deeper, and more meaningful way of working with them. That way is to make each virtue's image the focal point for periods of meditation in which we consider as fully possible all the implications of meaning for every detail and for how those details are related to each other. While doing so with the eyes open has much to offer, the benefits can be multiplied by actually memorizing the image so that it can be reproduced in the imagination and seen in detail with the mind's eye. In either case, with our minds concentrated on an image, we ask ourselves questions about what the details suggest, and we listen without judgment or censure for whatever comes up from within ourselves. We can do the same process with groups of images, like we have here. In this case, among all the questions we might ask, here's a good one to begin with. Why are all the virtues feminine? While allowing our intuition and inspiration to flow in response to such questions, we can also take those questions as prompts for further studies in Masonry and related fields. Philosophers, poets, theologians, and noteworthy leaders of society and government have been writing books about the virtues for thousands of years. The depth and breadth of thought that has gone into them is truly staggering. And I can assure you that anyone who undertakes such studies will be both challenged and richly rewarded. But there are still other ways in which we can make better use of our personifications of the virtues. And on that note, we'll turn to a previously mentioned authority on the art of memory. If you don't know this yet or not, Eric Arneson is actually the reincarnation of Giordano Bruno, and so this is for you. While the ritual of Freemasonry largely took shape during the Age of Enlightenment, its philosophical roots are actually in the Renaissance. One of the most brilliant minds of the late Renaissance was this Italian Dominican friar, Giordano Bruno, celebrated in his own time as an authority on the art of memory. There are many other amazing things to say about this man and the different subjects in which he excelled, including Hermeticism. He was far ahead of his time on many counts and so controversial in his contradiction of a number of church doctrines that he was eventually burned at the stake. I bet that hurt, Eric. Even so, today he is best known for his work with the art of memory. And we also know that one of his students was in contact with William Shaw, which I talked about earlier, when Shaw was declaring that all stonemasoned apprentices and fellows of the craft would be tested in the art of memory. It isn't possible in this presentation to do justice to all of Bruno's teachings on the art of memory. However, there are two aspects of those teachings that we will highlight in our consideration of how to make better use of our images of the virtues. Those two aspects of which our crafts leader, William Shaw, was surely aware are one, the method of Loki, and two, images as points of access to other levels of consciousness. Loki is the Latin word for places, and the method of Loki is the name of a memory trick that was well known among the ancient Greeks and Romans. They observed that, similar to the picture superiority effect, we remember things better when we can associate them with familiar locations in three-dimensional space. The basic practice is to observe actual physical locations as we try to memorize something. So, for example, the ancients might walk into a palace and at different locations, perhaps at statues or other visually interesting places, they would practice memorizing and recalling bits of knowledge. Then simply recalling the palace and the specific locations within them made it easier to recall the associated information. Later memory artists discovered that the method also works when we construct entirely fictional locations in the imagination. This picture shows Julius Camillo's memory theater organized according to the planets. If you take a moment to think about Freemasonry, you can see that we traditionally use both actual locations and imaginary ones in our memory work. The lodge itself is an actual memory palace. Consider all the things we associate with the 4 cardinal directions and the things we ritually say at each location during openings, closings, and degree rituals. For a more specific example, think of the lesson of the northeast corner, where we were each taught to liken ourselves to the cornerstone of the lodge and charged to be just and upright examples of Masonry in the world. I bet many of you are seeing the image of the northeast corner of some actual lodge room in your minds right now. Nodding heads. Good. I think it's good. Okay. For imaginary structures, we are taught about King Solomon's temple. Now, I'm not saying the actual temple was imaginary. Maybe it was, maybe it isn't, but it is for us now. In fact, in some variations of Masonic ritual, there are fairly detailed descriptions of the dimensions of the temple, its floor plan, and its furnishings. Thus, Masons have been supplied with a starting place for constructing a memory palace based on the temple, which obviously has profound connections to the religious and spiritual foundations of Freemasonry and Western society in general. Still, in either case, whether an actual lodge room or the historic, do that with the lodge. So let's each try to clearly remember a lodge room with which we are very familiar. Closing your eyes might help. I'll give you a little time to do this. Think about the various stations and places in that lodge room that you're familiar with and what they look like. In the east, at the master station, perhaps your lodge room has a symbolic column or pillar of wisdom, or the word wisdom, or a W there. In the south, at the junior warden station, maybe there's a pillar of beauty, the word beauty, or B. And in the senior warden station in the west, maybe there's a column of strength, the word strength, or an S. Maybe in your lodge room there are none of these visual cues, but you can still see the chairs and recall the ritual teachings of these symbolic pillars or columns on how they are associated with the principal officers at these stations. If your eyes are closed, you can open them now. Here you see associations I have made. For me, prudence, the virtue of exercising forethought and discretion, naturally fits with wisdom in the East. And behind her, I see a rising sun, horizon with the rising sun, by the way. In fact, in around 380 BC, Plato, the first philosopher to present the cardinal virtues as this set of 4, equated prudence with wisdom. That fortitude can be placed in the West with strength is even more obvious to me. I put temperance in the South with beauty because among the ancient Greeks, like Plato, temperance is the virtue most associated with the beauties not only of moderation, but of harmony, order, and grace. That leaves justice, which is also about order, but more in the social realm. I put her in the North, a place of darkness, because we often say justice is or should be blind. I also think the North is fitting because in the first 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge, after stepping into the lodge room, every hoodwinked candidate receives his first trials as he passes through the North. I could keep going with more connections in why this arrangement makes sense to me, but what matters in the art of memory is each practitioner making his own associations in the way most sensible to him. As you can see, the act of doing so begins to bring more structured organization, interconnectedness, complexity, and depth to one's Masonic knowledge and experience. Regardless of where you place them, each time we step into a lodge room, we can make better use of the images of the virtues by imagining them standing where we think they belong. In my case, I imagine them as giant living figures standing behind the chairs of the East, South, and West, and at the center of the wall in the North. From these locations, I visualize their influences radiating into the lodge room. All of these steps can also be taken with the 3 theological virtues. For example, you might visualize them on the EA's ladder, say in the northeast corner, or in a triangular form near or around the altar. That's my particular favorite, although I do both sometimes. Imagining the virtues as living figures leads us to the second aspect of the art of memory, which is the possibility that it can give us access to the intelligible world, or the intelligible realm, as it's called in this image. Plato conceived of the mind as working on a continuum, which he illustrated with the allegory of the divided line, which we see visually represented here. He held that our lowest use of the mind only deals with our most superficial perceptions, thoughts, and feelings about the things we experience with the senses in this world. The higher the function of the mind, the more one perceives and understands the invisible truths of things, and therefore knows more of their reality. Because these truths are invisible, they are intelligible only to one's reason and intuition. That's what Plato meant by the intelligible world or realm, which we might also think of as the spiritual world. Building on this model, Giordano Bruno reasoned that some things we see in the imagination, those composed in, by, and of the mind, must be higher on the continuum of consciousness than just representations of things we are actually experiencing physically, and therefore capable of giving us greater access to the intelligible world. In effect, mental images can serve as conduits or circuitry through which the higher truths they represent may enter into our awareness through the processes of intuition and inspiration. Bruno wasn't the first to have such thoughts. And in fact, this view is very similar to those of ancient Neoplatonic philosophers like Iamblichus and Proclus, who believed that properly constructed images could actually serve as means by which divine beings or the divine attributes of one omniscient and omnipotent deity could touch the souls of those who reverently and prayerfully contemplate them. This belief is still held by Christian Orthodox iconographers. Neither Iamblichus nor today's iconographers were practicing idol worship. They aren't confusing the images with the divine beings they represent. Instead, their reason and their faith guide them to use such images as symbolic means to more directly commune with their God or gods and the spiritual beings who serve their God or gods, and also bring their presence more directly into the manifest world. Speaking of more modern thinkers, here we have my buddy Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, who lived from 1875 to 1961. Jung was among the early depth psychologists, those interested in the subconscious or unconscious mind. Jung was particularly interested in the transformative power of dreams and came to understand that all dream imagery is symbolic and loaded with the potential for deep insight into the hidden dimensions of our psyches. This added fuel to his lifelong fascination with symbolism and myth, and the study of how myth and symbolism have facilitated the maturation, development, and transformation of individuals, groups, entire societies, and even all of humanity. One of Jung's great developments was the therapeutic practice of active imagination. In this practice, one turns within to recall a dream or other symbolic imagery, and then imagines interacting with the objects and characters in that imagery. This practice helps one realize things about themselves that would otherwise remain hidden, like deep inner conflicts, fears, hopes, profound wisdom, and hidden talents. Jung extensively practiced active imagination himself and used it with his own patients, and it led to some of his most significant insights about the inner workings of the human psyche. This is Jung's icon-like painting of a character he first encountered in a dream. His name is Philemon, and Jung did a great deal of active imagination with him. Jung called these moments fantasies, a kind of daydreaming that he willingly entered. What he learned from active imagination with Philemon and other characters is that, like characters in sleeping dreams, they can be experienced as saying and doing unexpected things as if they have minds of their own. This led Jung to realize that through such images, he was coming into contact with parts of himself that were normally unconscious, which is simply to say, outside of his usual waking awareness. Jung also noted that for many people, this involves rediscovering our potentials for creativity and play, which society all too often conditions us to repress as childish, unproductive, and even shameful. Yet, society also ironically praises in great artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, and other visionaries. These experiences, along with his studies in the myths and symbols of humanity, greatly contributed to Jung's understanding that there is a universal or collective unconscious for humanity as a whole, from which the archetypes of human nature itself are constantly speaking to all of us. So, what was the point with all of this talk about Giordano Bruno, Plato, Christian iconographers, and Carl Jung? It was to show that while there are many different ways to conceptualize exactly what is happening, human beings have repeatedly found great value in actually interacting with symbolic characters like our personifications of the virtues. And it should be stressed that such interaction is not only the detached experience of studying and analyzing such an image, or even meditating on it to see what spontaneous reactions of thoughts and feeling we have. It can also include actively engaging such characters in conversations and other imagined activities. So if you're one of those people who just naturally talks to people who aren't there, this is made for you. The way one does this is simple. If you want to know more about a virtue and see what you might learn by interacting with her, then begin by memorizing an image of her. Once you can clearly recall the image in detail, you're ready to do active imagination. In accord with Masonic tradition, I recommend that you begin by invoking the aid of deity. Then you simply imagine meeting her face to face, perhaps in your mental lodge room, as we discussed earlier. It is usually best to limit initial sessions to very simple interactions, building the skill to stay focused on her image and get used to letting it have facial expressions and small body movements like those exchanged between people who are silently greeting each other. With practice, your interactions can become increasingly dynamic and spontaneous, such as you asking questions and receiving responses from her. She might even lead you into other imagery, another scene and activities in which you might learn something relevant to your question. One thing I will note from my own personal experience is that the voice of a character like this usually speaks directly to my mind, so that I rarely experience its mouth moving like it would with a flesh and blood human being. Your mileage might vary. Another common experience for me is that responses to my questions often come in the form of other images suddenly arising, as if the virtue is showing them to me, mind to mind, in a mental slideshow. Sometimes responses come through facial expressions, gestures, and even more elaborate movements like symbolic dance. For some reason, a lot of my characters like to talk to me through symbolic dance. My point here is to let you know that active imagination doesn't work in exactly the same way from one person to another, or even one time to another for the same person. You just need to practice, experiment, and build your own unique rapport with the virtues. But please keep in mind 2 caveats. First, just because an image tells you or shows you something, that doesn't necessarily mean you should accept it and act on it without thinking carefully about it, no matter how profound it might seem in the moment. We still have the responsibility to think critically about it and consider the consequences of acting upon it. The second caveat is that it isn't wise to go around yammering to others about your active imagination experiences. It's best to treat them with a sense of respect even reverence, and not cheapen them by making them objects of entertainment or using them to puff up our egos. Not to mention, some people are just going to think you're freaking crazy. In short, both of these caveats remind us that we still need to exercise virtues like prudence and temperance in more ordinary ways. So now let's take a moment to review what we've covered. I know it's been a lot, before opening things up for discussion. My intention was to address each of these questions. We saw that Masonry did not invent these personified images of the virtues. When the virtues were included in Masonic rituals, such images were widely known both in and out of the fraternity. Furthermore, they had already been commonly found in art and used in religion and education for many centuries. Pictures can communicate many possibilities, layers, and nuances of meaning. That range of possibilities allows for interpretation and application in many ways that may be more relevant and meaningful to a given individual. It also allows for epiphanies and aha moments of insight that can facilitate significant changes in the way a person thinks about something or applies it to his life. We also remember pictures better than words, which offers many benefits in the Masonic experience. So, to actually move from theory to practice, we can use the picture superiority effect to enhance recall and real-world application, meditate on the images and their visual clues to stimulate more questions, insight, and study about the virtues, and use the method of Loki to make the virtues more present to us in our lodge rooms, both our actual lodge rooms and our memory lodge rooms. And use active imagination to engage the virtues for the deepest possible access of resources in our own psyches. So this concludes my presentation on esoteric engagement with Masonic imagery. I really thank you for your attention and patience. And if you'd like to learn more about contemplative practices in Masonry, here are some resources for you. And we'll wrap it up there and maybe have some good discussion.
Feel free to ask any questions you might have, brothers.
Or make comments. Yes.
Question. What do you think the significance of the feminine is, or the sacred, the allusion to the sacred feminine in all of the imagery that we see?
Well, first of all, the fact that you're using the term sacred feminine gets right to it.
Okay.
I think that one of the reasons we personify the virtues in feminine form is to help us access that dimension of deity. I mean, these images were developed within a hugely patriarchal society where everything was based on male norms. And as males, particularly for those of us who are heterosexual, cisgender males, relating to the feminine is everything that we relate to as beautiful, as intriguing and mysterious and desirable. It's natural for us to project a feminine character. Now, what Jung would say is, and also I think it's a reasonable interpretation of psychospiritual alchemy, that the great work is balancing out our masculinity with these things that we would typically identify with the feminine, and recognizing that they're really all parts of a greater whole that transcends the masculine and feminine. And so by incorporating and integrating the virtues and recognizing that they're in feminine form, it naturally stimulates the question for anybody who ponders these images about why feminine? Well, because everything that we recognize as virtuous doesn't just come in masculine form, and that there are many feminine examples of the things that we consider to be virtues. And by embracing that, we embrace more of our own wholeness.
Interesting. And that makes me think that it's also in our journey as that middle pillar.
Yes.
And exactly. We're taught from one side to be one. We're taught to be one side, but we are also taught from the other side. So why not try and identify
Yes.
what that potential on the side? It's not always masculine and feminine on either side, but when you choose it to be, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Great answer, thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Giordano?
I was going to also add to that, like there's in a lot of the old texts on making images, on creating them,
Yeah.
you're taught to include things in the image that excite emotion, right?
Yes.
Things that have a greater effect on our emotional state are easier to remember.
Yes.
That's probably another reason why attractive women were used as art images. But also another thing is the color in the image.
Yes.
You'll see repeating patterns in the color used for the different virtues. So also pay attention to those when you're making yours.
Yeah, that particular set of images that I prefer for the 4 cardinal virtues. Let me back up here.
Yeah, you can see they each have 2 kind of contrasting colors.
Let me find a good image of them without all the stuff over. There we go. Yeah, you can see, like you said, the contrasting colors, and just think about the 4 classical elements and how you might connect them with those colors, for example. So, yeah. Thank you, Giordano. Yes, brother.
So, the very last slide with the bullet points,
Yes.
that's basically showing the blueprint of how to bridge the gap
Yes.
with theory and practice for virtue. But in the place of, in the sphere of education, academia, where people go to study virtue and ethics,
Mm-hmm.
why aren't those included in that? Even like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is how to apply virtue in the city in daily life, never talks about any of that really. Plato's Republic, Rawls' theory of justice. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
There's so much of an emphasis with study and analyzation and getting to understand the conceptual apparatus that governs virtue. But when you finish all of that studying, there's no like resuscitation, activation of it in daily life. When I was going and reading the cipher for the Enter Apprentice Mason, that memory work, I almost feel like have it at the forefront of my awareness more than a full, 4
Yes.
years of an undergraduate degree in ethics.
Yeah.
So why do you think this stuff is not in academia?
Some good questions. what was that? It's a really good question. And I can speculate on that. I don't know that I have a good historical answer for that. Dr. Bruno?
There's this great book called Eros and the Renaissance by Juan Culiano. I think it was published in 1984. That has a really excellent analysis of sort of the death of image-based teaching.
Oh, wow.
And what he calls he's got a great term for it. Basically, like the execution of the imagination in Western thought.
What's it called?
Eros and the Magic in the Renaissance.
Eros and Magic in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
All right.
It'll totally answer that question.
Awesome, thank you.
So great recommendation there. And just I think one of my views about this is that probably this was a technology that was taken for granted by the ancients. They didn't feel the need to write about it because it was just such a part of their lives. Now, I can only draw on past life memories to be able to verify that. And that's not going to be good for anybody else in the room. I'm pulling your leg. Okay. Yes, sir.
Actually, think about it, it's really the advent of writing that
Yes.
made all of this come included.
Yes.
All of the memory recall stuff was in how people learned things before the advent of writing, or before it was before literacy, right? Before it was people were broadly educated to know how to write.
Right.
Writing is just isolated from books. And I'll say from my knowledge of neuroscience, try not to talk too long, but the inner lizard part of our brain,
Yes.
not the cortex that thinks about stuff, that inner lizard part processes like logarithmically more data than the part of your brain that adds 2 + 2. So, and that's the part of your brain that responds to images as opposed to written words and speech. So there's a lot more, obviously, there's a lot more happening that if you're drawing on when you're working with imagery and thinking process through that sensory part of your brain as opposed to thinking about things, which is what I agree with.
Right. This is one of the reasons why what we call body language is so important, for example. And when I talked about my characters in my imagination doing, kind of interpretive dance, that's the way it's communicated to me at that really basic level. And then I take the symbolism of their movements and begin to unravel that. And it's like Jung's experience of active imagination. It draws things out that wouldn't have otherwise come out. But it's that process of unraveling the symbolism, of taking what was unconscious and reptilian or primitive, and bringing it to this greater clarity for the rational mind. That process is a very important process to engage, and we need to go through all of those steps that we've been talking about. Great comments. Thank you.
I call that making the unconscious conscious.
Yes.
Taking those sense impressions and then making them part of your incorporating them into your
Very well said. Other comments? Questions? Yes.
Obviously, I think I can just say one word in terms of tarot cards.
Oh, yeah.
Tarot cards.
Yeah.
All of this stuff.
Yeah. Great portals to walk through. Yeah.
So
Yes.
I think Giordano and I have had this conversation a little bit,
Yes.
but in the context of the Masonic Lodge movement, it tends to be, and maybe this is further into the Martin Luther effect, rather stripped down of imagery, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the stations and there's the places, there's the G, there's Boaz and Joaquin, there's the altar, there's the circumpunct, and in some lodges, there's the ship. But why is there a lack of richness, in your opinion, within the context of the lodge?
That's a good question, and I'll give you my answer unless Dr. Bruno gives it first. Go ahead.
Well, we actually have way more props than these now. Like, original lodges were entirely original. You basically, the Tyler was sort of responsible for maybe like sketching in like the floor or something of that nature. But all of us were responsible for filling our lodges with the images of the symbols in our heads. We then invented rooms, we had 0 props. We had a gallery. So.
Yeah, that would be my answer as well, is that it provides us not an entirely blank canvas, but more like an empty filing cabinet that we can then go in and file things. And one of the reasons I think that that's important is because I was talking about how this has to be an individualized experience. Where you put things is something you need to choose. Tradition will give us some guidelines, of course, but making those connections has to be the work of each individual.
Within that case, like historically, I tended to view Masonry as a relatively degenerating tradition from, like, say, the Masons of the 17th, 18th century, even into the early 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like it's possibly actually still a developing tradition?
Yeah, I think that's a possible way to look at it. I think that if you look at there's kind of a cyclical kind of pattern in the rise and fall of interest in esotericism and Freemasonry. The thing that we've experienced in the 20th century and leading into the 21st century, this idea of esotericism being no, we don't talk about that happened in the 20th century, the mid-20th century in particular. That's not new. That's happened before. And you can go back and look even in the 1700s and find Masons writing letters just lamenting of it. Oh gosh, these brothers just don't know what they're doing. They're not doing it the way it used to be done. We need to bring back the old ways. And so that's just been continually there. And so I think in ways that it has been an ongoing development. But I think you can make the case that there have been some things lost, like the art of memory, for example. I'm really convinced of what I said in my presentation today, that early speculatives would have understood what the art of memory was, at least from their interaction with those operatives in the late 16th century. Yes?
The speculatives and the operatives are the same.
Yes, yeah. I'm not saying that operatives weren't doing speculation. I'm really talking about accepted Masons when I say it's early speculatives. The early accepted Masons would have learned about art of memory through Masonry if they hadn't already. Yes?
I got some minutiae questions for you.
Okay.
So I think earlier you mentioned that the east has a sun, but it's on the horizon.
Yeah.
Is there a specific reason why it's on the horizon?
Yeah, so let me just talk a little bit more about the imagery that's in my head when I'm in lodging, just like I was today. So one of the things that I see is I'm using the imagery that's described in our ritual. Above us is a starry decked canopy. In the east, I see the rising sun because of what the worshipful master does in the association with the rising sun. Between the rising sun on the horizon and the worshipful master, right at his back, I see prudence. It's also tradition that this is not actually in our ritual, I don't think. It's not in Texas ritual, but it may be in other places, that there is a ray of light extending between the three great lights and the worshipful master when the lodge is open. I visualize that. The bringing together of the square and compass is a symbolic representation of the blazing star. Whether you look at the blazing star as a pentagram or a hexagram, you can make either figure with the square and compass, or something that alludes to either figure with the square and compass. And just like the high priest invokes the presence of deity, the Shekinah, on the Ark of the Covenant, so when we bring the square and compass together on the altar of Masonry, the divine presence, the blazing star, which is Shekinah, is present. So I visualize her glowing star of presence there on top of the three great lights, and then beaming her light to the worshipful master. In the south, I see the sun at meridian height, shining down on the junior warden. And right behind him is Temperance, imparting her qualities of character to him. If you think about what he does with labor and refreshment, his role there in Temperance makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Then, as we move to the west, the sky gets darker again. And I see the sunset. By the way, I see in the southwest corner is where I put the moon. These things don't have to be astronomically correct, but the symbolism is important. It depends on the time of the month. And then between that setting sun, which I see is darker than the rising sun in the east, between that setting sun and the senior warden, right at his back, is fortitude. And the senior warden talks about the strength of the lodge, right? And he's associated with the column of strength. And interestingly, what he says, I'll just get into a little bit of an interpretation here. What he says about his role is that it's harmony, according to your ritual. In some jurisdictions, it's peace and harmony, and in others, it's peace, harmony, and unity is the chief strength and support of the lodge. And so it gives you a different view of what we might mean by fortitude than maybe the average person thinks of as fortitude. And then the skies get even darker as we move to the north, where I see the morning, not the morning star. I see the morning star with the sunrise in the east. I see the North Star in the Big Dipper, and below the North Star, I see Justice standing in the middle. Now, you guys have your chaplain in the due north, which I think is really cool. We don't do that in my jurisdiction. Oh, well, good for you.
Houston, Washington.
Yeah, and so then directly overhead, there's this kind of shading effect. You can still see the starry canopy above, but it fades as you get closer to the south. The stars dissipate, the light of the stars dissipates in the light of the sun. So that's what I see. And then, like I was saying earlier, I see the three theological virtues standing around the altar. And the way that you have your altar and your representations of the lesser lights, the tapers, set up, I see charity standing to the south of your altar here, and faith and hope on the other side. So that's what I'm visualizing, along with the light that was helping Nate do his job. And wherever he goes in the lives, that beam of light is coming straight to him from the blazing star. That's what I'm visualizing the whole time during. And the thing is, you might be surprised. This may sound like a lot of stuff to try to think about and remember, but it can become habitual. You don't even have to force it. It just is there. As soon as you want it on, it's on. Yes, brother.
You might not know this, but in the southern hemisphere is a constellation called the Altar.
Ah,
And it rises just, well, it depends on the time of year, but it's visible from Jerusalem. And right above it is another constellation called the Triangle.
yeah.
And there you have the Masonic constellation visible from Jerusalem.
Very cool. Thank you. Yes, brother.
More of a comment for you. Have you been to Kenton Lodge with all your visual?
No, I haven't.
Go.
Okay, thank you. I will. Yes.
Chris Murphy talks about this in one of his talks, but in the interdependence degree, the part of the lecture of Jacob's ladder involves a lot of symbolic uses of the virtues, and it's really, really worth revisiting for people who are working with these images. That's good homework.
Thanks. In the next edition, I think it's in edition of the Fraternal Review for the Southern California Research Lodge, there's going to be an article in there that I have written on combining the principal tenets and the cardinal and theological virtues and the Interdependence Mason's Ladder, and how you can combine those things and actually work with